he needs very anywhere in the world. He's well known. He's written many books. He's in fact probably the leader of development thinking in the world for the last 20, 30 years, the author of MDGs, the author of SDGs, etc. So Professor Sachs, because I know you're short of time, I won't go into any lengthy introduction, but I'll give Fahad Zulfikar, one of our colleagues who invited you, the opportunity to introduce you very briefly, but we want to go directly to your talk. Fahad, can you briefly introduce Professor Sachs, then we move on.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much. A big warm welcome to Professor Sachs. Professor Jeffery Sachs serves as the Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he holds the rank of University Professor as well. Professor Sachs is also the President of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a Commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development, and SDGs advocate for UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. To his credit are also authored and edited books, including the 3 New York Times bestsellers, including The End of Poverty, Commonwealth, Economics for a Crowded Planet, and The Price of Civilization. He's also the co-recipient of the 2015 Blue Planet Prize, and he's twice named among the Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders and received 34 honorary degrees. A big warm welcome again, sir. Thank you so much for being part of our webinar. We really look forward to hearing to you on international aid and policy freedom from small open economies.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. Over to you to speak about policy freedom and international aid in small open economies. Thank you.
Nadeem, thank you to you, and Fahad, thank you so much also for the invitation, the warm welcome, and to the Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, Developing Economies. I'm really grateful and honored to be with you and want to brainstorm. I want to change the title slightly because I want to talk about Pakistan and learn from you also. So I don't think we could call you a small open economy. You're an open economy, but you have a lot of people and a lot of weight and concern. And I want to brainstorm with you about Pakistan and sustainable development, and also hope that I can be helpful because I play a lot of roles that sometimes are practical once in a while in the United Nations system. And my day-to-day life is involved with trying to promote the Sustainable Development Goals, to try to make them actually happen. This is not the easiest task in a discombobulated world, and it certainly has not been an easy challenge in the course of the COVID pandemic. Last year was really a devastating year for the whole world. It was the worst economic shock since the Great Depression, rivaling the Great Depression in scope. It was the worst public health shock in at least 100 years, maybe beyond. And we're not out of this yet. One might have hoped that by now the pandemic would be decisively under control, but that is certainly not the case. We continue to have new variants, surges. Africa looks like it may be entering a third wave. There's lots of unknowns about the evolution of the virus, the dynamics, the efficacy of the vaccines, the timing for vaccine coverage. So big questions still are in front of us. But at the same time, there is a lot of discussion and debate about what to do based on what we have learned in moving forward. So build forward better is the motto of the UN system. How do we get out of this mess in a way which propels the Sustainable Development Goals rather than widens the gap between rich and poor in the world? Not only was COVID-19 a huge setback and continues to be, but it was a major source of growing inequalities and injustices in the world as well. Poor countries are not only hard hit, but they have almost no margin of maneuver. Rich countries have been less hit yet, they have much more fiscal and financial room for maneuver. In the United States, rather remarkably, between March 2020 and March 2021, Congress in the US voted 3 major packages of emergency COVID response that totaled $6 trillion, which is a lot of money, even for the United States economy. Perhaps 30% of GDP spent in a 12, or not spent, appropriated in a 12-month period. And that means budget deficits on the order of 15% of GDP in 2020 and 15% of GDP in 2021. The high-income world as a whole, according to IMF estimates, has mobilized about $15 trillion of emergency financing. But then look at the rest of the world. The upper middle income countries could do less, the lower middle income countries still less, and the poor countries were left to tighten their belts. They had very little financing. If it was 15 trillion for the high income countries of emergency financing, we could say it's probably 100 billion to 200 billion for the more numerous lower income and lower middle income countries. In other words, really, a small amount could be mobilized. It's clear that the global financial system discriminates markedly, even decisively, between the rich and the poor. I don't think we fully understand this. It's an intellectual puzzle. Why the US gets to borrow so cheaply, one crucial answer, of course, is the US owns the printing press for US dollars, and the US dollar is the key global currency of settlement. That may be the exorbitant privilege that is the defining reason, but suffice it to say that the rich countries have a higher debt to GDP ratio than the poorer countries. They have larger deficits than the poorer countries. They're in no position to tell the poor countries, behave yourself, get your budgets under control. This is the opposite of what the rich countries are doing and are advising each other to do. But the poor countries are left out of the story. So a crucial task for us going forward is to use this crisis to accomplish what could be called, but maybe it's a misnomer, Bretton Woods II. Bretton Woods set the financial foundations for the post-World War II period, at least through the 1970s and 80s. We haven't had really a Bretton Woods system since then, but it did set the framework after World War II. Broadly speaking, it was successful, but it is no longer functioning for the world we claim we want, which is a world of inclusion and a world in which finance should be supporting the developing countries to make the investments that they need to achieve sustainable development. I wanted to share a few slides quickly, if I could. So I'm going to just look at a PowerPoint because I wanted to talk about Pakistan in this context and raise some specific questions and challenges. So I want to talk about Pakistan and the SDGs in the post-COVID period, hoping we're going to be in the post-COVID period very soon. And of course, the focus is on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. I take that to be a package deal. So I don't view the Paris Climate Agreement as something different or apart from the 17 SDGs. But the 17 SDGs, in my view, are not only our globally agreed goals, but really are a desirable framework. And the reason they're a desirable framework is that they approach society holistically, saying that what we need to do is ensure economic rights for all. That is the escape from deprivations such as poverty, hunger, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to classrooms, lack of access to safe water and sanitation, lack of access to electrification, that we need to ensure social inclusion and narrower inequalities of wealth and income, especially SDG 5 on gender equality and SDG 10 on income and wealth inequalities, and that we need to do this in an environmentally sound way because we're in the middle of an ongoing environmental catastrophe or set of catastrophes. The global warming is but one of the catastrophes, the destruction of ecosystem functioning, the loss of habitats, the radical decline of species abundance, of non-human species, the pollution of the air, the water, the oceans, the soils, and now the increasing frequency of pandemic diseases are all part of a massive disruption of the environment. And that is essentially SDGs 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. So the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals calling for improved material well-being, social inclusion and social justice, and environmental sustainability are, in my opinion, attractive, worthwhile, and really fundamentally grounded in universal human rights, including economic rights and the right of every person to dignity and to having economic needs, vital economic needs met. So we're in the midst of this active agenda right now, the Paris Agreement, the Convention on Biological Diversity to protect biodiversity and ecosystems, and the World Food Systems Summit, which will take place in September. Each year, the group that I lead for the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, issues a report. We just came out with the report last week, or a couple of weeks ago, on the state of the SDGs globally. We showed that using the standardized metrics that we've been using since 2015, that the world suffered a significant setback in progress towards the SDGs in 2020, the first setback since the start of the SDGs themselves. We also look at the country experiences. And so I wanted to report to you on the findings regarding Pakistan. So Pakistan has a score, an aggregate score of 57.7. That is meant to be a quick and rough indicator that Pakistan has achieved 57% of the way from the worst case to SDG achievement. More than half, but still putting Pakistan 129th of the 165 countries that we examined this year. We do a quick dashboard, kind of a street light of green, yellow, and red to understand for the 17 goals where things stand. We're pretty tough graders, so if any of the indicators shows up red, we give red for the broad category. And Pakistan shows up bright red in most of the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, only on low carbon energy or low emissions of CO2 does Pakistan show up green in SDG 13. That's because of still low levels of energy use overall. But on many of the deprivation issues, hunger, access to healthcare, education, clean water and sanitation, electrification, access to the internet, land and marine ecosystem protection, Pakistan shows up red. And the way that the index works is that we have, I don't remember for this year's report, around 150 indicators spread across the 17 SDGs. And then we look at sub-indexes for each of the 17 SDGs. And I have put in the PowerPoint, which I will share with everybody and make available afterwards, each of the indicators for each of the goals. And they themselves have the streetlight coloration of red, yellow, green. Actually, we have yellow and beige, but Pakistan shows up as red. In other words, a severe gap with SDG goals on many dimensions. When it comes to hunger, there is, as you know well, a high level of child stunting. In the health goal, SDG 3, there is still a high under 5 mortality. In SDG 4 on education, there is still a low secondary school completion rate. And that's low even at the lower secondary level, but the SDG 4 calls for universal completion at upper secondary level. So Pakistan has a really significant education challenge. On gender, girls' education remains problematic, really a large gap between boys and girls in school enrollments and completion rates. There is still poor access to sanitation. There is low access to clean fuels for cooking and to electricity. I'm not saying anything that's not known, but these show up clearly in the indicators. When it comes to the digital economy, internet usage on the official data shows Pakistan really lagging far behind on internet use and on mobile phone subscription. So there's low internet use and low connectivity, very low research and development spending as a share of GDP. On SDG 10, high income inequality. On SDG 11, high urban air pollution with especially PM 2.5 pollutants, low access to piped water and other gaps with SDG achievement. So when we turn to the final categories, insufficient protection of marine and terrestrial sites, a low recorded access affordability of justice. And one of the indicators we look at is the amount of social spending on health and education. Pakistan is very low on the aggregate of spending on health and education, just 4% of GDP, which is really unusually low. So what can one make of this? In my view, the SDG agenda is an investment agenda. It's overwhelmingly about deploying finance for three kinds of investments. Human capital investments, the preeminent investment, SDGs 3, 4, 5. That is access universally, boys and girls, men and women, to healthcare and to education. It is investments in physical infrastructure, especially clean energy that we need globally for climate safety, as well as for the digital economy, which offers potentially the universal access to critical services like telemedicine or distance education or e-governance, but cannot work when most of the society is not online, and investments in other core infrastructure, not only digital and green, but of course, transport, water and sanitation, and a sustainable urban environment. In the work of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, we think of 6 large investment programs. education and technology being number 1, health and well-being number 2, clean energy and industry being number 3, sustainable food and land use being number 4, smart cities and transport being number 5, and digital technologies being number 6. My way of thinking about this issue is that these are multi-year, even decadal or 2-decadal public investment programs overwhelmingly, where we need larger outlays, mainly by the public sector, because these are either goods that require universal access, they are economic rights, or they are natural monopolies with the network characteristics, whether it's the power grid or the connectivity or of course, urban sewerage and water systems and the like. But these are largely public investments that need to be taken in a context of still capital scarcity, extreme capital scarcity in both physical and human capital. And that the main challenge of achieving the SDGs is therefore an investment challenge, mobilizing the financing and making the public investments satisfactorily to build the human capital and the physical infrastructure. This should not be controversial, I think, not surprising, not even new at all. But the idea of designing a comprehensive public investment program and achieving the financing is, to my mind, the homework of the Sustainable Development Goals, but is not so easy to do. And the main reason it's not so easy to do for developing countries, of course, is the lack of adequate fiscal space to carry out the SDG agenda. For the rich countries like my own, the United States, it's just a matter of we're stupid. I can't think of any other explanation. The US is so rich, but filled with such greed, short-sightedness, and political corruption that we can't even use our wealth to ensure clean water for the American people or universal health coverage. It's just a nasty, greedy political system, but not a lack of financing. But for developing countries, it really is a lack of fiscal space. And it starts with that financial system that I spoke of earlier. If Pakistan wants to borrow internationally, say a 20-year dollar-denominated debt, you could imagine, I don't know what today's rate would be, but you could imagine the yield required on that would be 8 or 10%. Or maybe the bond markets would say, no, thank you, we don't want to take more Pakistan risk. But if the United States goes out to borrow in the same capital markets, the interest rate might be 1.5, 1.6% for a 10 to 20-year US dollar denominated loan. So the fiscal space issue, to my mind, is absolutely paramount. What does this imply practically speaking? Well, one of Pakistan's great challenges is that not only is there no international financial space, but the domestic budgetary space is extremely limited because the government revenues as a share of gross domestic product is very low in Pakistan. Exactly how low depends on the year and the forecast, but I think it's right to say somewhere around 15% of GDP is an accurate assessment of revenues to GDP, maybe a little bit higher these years. But if you look at government revenues as a share of GDP in the IMF World Economic Outlook database, I show you where Pakistan is on the global page. It is a low tax country. And being a low tax country, it means that the outlays on challenges like health and education are commensurately very low. And it means that the performance on the SDGs is commensurately very much delayed or weak. So this is one major issue. Now, interestingly, it's a project that I've worked on with the IMF for a number of years now. I have been a big proponent of this work and a big fan of the work, and I hope a useful partner with the work. The IMF has begun to do what I think is extremely important, is to ask how much would it cost for a country, in this case Pakistan, to actually achieve the SDGs. So if you're doing a dynamic analysis of the Pakistan economy, one way to do that, of course, is to say what investment program would be sufficient to achieve the goals that we've set. And there is a very nice paper just recently written, working paper 108 of 2021, called Pakistan Spending Needs for Reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. And just to run through this very quickly, the IMF team looked at several of the major SDG categories: education, healthcare, electricity, roads, water, and sanitation. And for each, it asked the right question, in my view: what additional spending would be needed to achieve the SDGs? In the case of education, for example, Pakistan spends 2.4% of GDP on public education. The IMF says that needs to be at least 7.7% of GDP in 2030. And that's the flavor of this analysis: finding a pathway to achieve the 2030 objective. On healthcare, instead of spending 0.9% of GDP in the public sector, the IMF says it should be a minimum of 4.3% of GDP. I'm not so sure on the precise numbers. For example, on healthcare, the IMF's model is half public, half private. I live in a country like that. It's a mess. I would recommend a public outlay model for healthcare. But whether it's public or private, there's definitely a large public component needed. Overall, healthcare spending needs to rise from something like 2.8% of GDP, now mostly private outlays in Pakistan, up to more than 8% of GDP by 2030. Similarly, on water and sanitation, the IMF's calculation is that's an incremental 2% of GDP outlay. On electricity, I doubt the numbers I'm about to show, but they claim only an added 0.7% of GDP. I don't think that's sufficient from what I know. And then on roads, an incremental 2.3% of GDP. This is per year in order to meet the basic infrastructure requirements. Overall, the IMF concludes the following way: making substantial progress in critical SDG sectors will require additional annual spending of about 16% of GDP in 2030. Overall, total additional spending needs in Pakistan are substantial at around 16%. Additional spending needs for education and healthcare are especially large. While the estimates refer to spending requirements for 2030, given the size of the spending needs and the challenges that must be addressed, the scale up of spending should start well before 2030, amen, taking into account the various financing options and fiscal space, which the IMF is not comprehensive about, I have to add. But the point of all of this exercise is Pakistan cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals with anything like the current level of outlays. This is the basic point. There needs to be a massive expansion of public outlays, and that needs to be financed. And that is the challenge in an unfair and selfish world. How are we going to get these needs financed, not only for Pakistan, but for developing countries that are capital scarce all over the world. Well, there are several financing options that I want to enter into our discussion that will start just now. First is the possibility of greater domestic tax revenues. In part, that depends on global tax reform as well, because the international tax system has been made by Britain and the United States to foster tax evasion and tax avoidance. The tax havens are, to a large extent, the creation of the British Empire and of the American Empire, if I may say. We have them in the Caribbean. They're all over the world, but they are a creation of the powerful countries. Now, I would say with some happiness and relief that the Biden administration has recently called for a minimum corporate tax rate around the world of at least 15%. This is an important step forward. Of course, in the US, the Republicans, who are the party of plutocracy and tax evasion, immediately said that's un-American to try to collect those taxes from the corporations. You can't really make it up how awful they are, but that is our political fight right now. Second opportunity, of course, is debt relief. The net debt of Pakistan internationally, or of the government, I should have said, is around 80% of GDP. It's not crushing, but the interest rates should be much lower than they are. Third, a particular problem for Pakistan is that there are several claims that have been made against Pakistan in the so-called investor-state dispute settlement processes, where the government of Pakistan is being demanded to pay for various projects, notably a mining project in Baluchistan that never actually took place. This is a scandal in my mind, and Pakistan should never pay such a settlement, but the demand by the Arbitration Commission is several $billion, and that is money that should be used for healthcare and education, not to pay greedy and typically corrupt investors who have no claim at all on Pakistan, in my view. Next is a great expansion of financing at low interest by the multilateral development banks. This is actually my main practical advice and hope. We created a system of the World Bank and regional development banks, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and so forth. Several new development banks have been brought online, notably the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the new development bank that the BRICS countries started. The total lending by these institutions is far too small compared to the objectives of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. As you know, the rich countries long promised to help the poor countries with climate change with a minimum of at least $100 billion a year of official loans and grants that was supposed to be in effect at least as of 2020. The rich countries have never fulfilled that promise, even though it's 12 years old. And I believe that the multilateral development banks are the most practical and effective way. So I would like to see a major scaling up of low interest lending by the MDBs, made possible by a major increase of paid in capital by the shareholders of those banks. And of course, a fifth area that has some application is SDG oriented private investment, especially foreign direct investment. These are the topics that I think should be front and center of global diplomacy in the next in the next 2 years. Oops. Are we still there?
Yes, you are.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah. And I am hoping, I've said that we need a second Bretton Woods, but since Indonesia is hosting the G20 next year, I'm calling it not Bretton Woods 2, but Bali 1. I hope that in 2022, we could have a serious global financial summit that would say that it is no longer tolerable in our world that capital flows only to the profligate rich governments, but not to the poor countries that are in urgent need of increased financing. So I am working and hoping perhaps we can work together on this to try to put this financing gap more centrally on the policy agenda during the next 12 months as the urgent agenda, in fact, to take seriously the SDGs. Finally, let me say that our global network of universities, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, is operating across the world. And I hope that as academics and scholars, we can raise our voice to say, this is what the world needs. It's one thing for governments to state goals. It's quite another thing for those goals to be achieved. And the critical aspect of that is that we put the world's financing where it needs to go, whether by taxation, global tax reform, debt relief, multilateral development bank financing. But there is a large, discernible, demonstrable financing gap for the SDGs, and that is our biggest practical challenge, closing that financing gap. Let me stop there, turn it back over to you, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. This is a very good overview of the SDGs and development world, as we expected from you, a masterful overview of everything. And I certainly hope all of us will pray that you succeed in the Bretton Woods too. We definitely need that. But I know you have to leave early, so I'll just be very brief, ask you a quick question and go to the audience. But Professor Sachs, you leave whenever you like. We'll continue the discussion after you too, because it's an important discussion. So just let us know when you want to leave. That'll be fine.
Thank you.
I just have a quick question that I want to raise with you. You've highlighted SDGs and finance, and I think that's very important. Finance is important, but I think there's another aspect that we see here in Pakistan. Not only are we performing very badly on SDGs, we also perform badly on governance. We also perform badly on competitiveness and corruption. So we've got a lot of problems that we need to take care of. At the PIDE, we have estimated that the government footprint, which is the regulatory burden on the economy, may be as high as 70 to 80% of GDP. And that regulatory burden, as you're well aware, is also acting like a taxation on the economy. And in fact, what's happened is that people are terribly scared of investing. Our investment to GDP ratio has fallen to 11%, while on average it is 15%. The reason it is that is because the government policy is not static. It keeps changing. Taxation changes every 3 months. People are mortally scared of putting in place any investment. And as you pointed out, and we owe you a great gratitude, gratitude that you called out the foreign investment Liquidity in Pakistan. You did a very good job, and we are all very pleased to see that. But the other side of that is that we lack the competence to be able to negotiate such complex deals. I remember seeing the Liquidity contract. That was like a room full of documents, which I had no way to read, and I had no legal capacity to read that. How do we negotiate these deals? We come out short because we are in a haste to get financing, and we end up signing away our future. And then we go to courts, and it's a lot of time wasted. It's not just Liquidity, there's so many other contracts that we lose on. Bilateral investment treaties, we lose on all the time, and we don't know how to handle this. The world is getting increasingly complex, and we don't have the human resource to deal with that complex world. Something has to be done about that too. The other thing that I would point out to you, even though I agree with you that financing could increase, And yes, we could tax the economy more, but we looked at the use of funds in Pakistan. For example, our development spending. We have seen that our development spending is very poorly conducted. No cost benefit analysis is conducted, and the yield is very low. Now, in that sort of a system, what do we do? So we have a trade-off between finance or taxation, government footprint, investment, and the government policies. We have a trade-off between the use of funds and taxation. We have a further trade-off, a policy freedom, for example. Our government now, Sachs, you'll appreciate it, is much more responsive to international donors than to the local population. In fact, our government, I would argue, and we did a webinar, you'll probably appreciate it, with Gustav Papanek. I don't know whether you remember this.
Of course.
In Boston. And Gus Papanek was the man who came, those of us who are my age remember, was the man who came and designed Pakistan's policy. And the thing is that even then, we had no policy freedom. Even today, we don't have any policy freedom because our government is looking to the foreign donors for policy, and domestic policy debate is totally absent. So what would be your perspective on these 3 or 4 challenges?
Yeah, these are all pointing in one absolute direction. You can't live without government, but you can barely live with it because there is, unfortunately, no way to accomplish what needs to be accomplished by the market alone, certainly not, and not the kind of market that we have. But on the other hand, government can ruin things as well as create things. So government competence is a bottom line. This is not an ingenious observation on my part. This is basic. Every effective state, and that's of any kind of political system, by the way, whether it's a democracy, an authoritarian state, it doesn't change this question. The question is effectiveness of being able to set goals, to have the discipline to carry out the analytics, and then to implement what needs to be accomplished. And one can go through every success story of economic development. Effective government has been an important part of this. Now, each country's situation, of course, depends on historical legacy, geopolitics, domestic social considerations, but strengthening government capacity is a sine qua non. I'm working with a number of governments trying to help simply to formulate plans and public policies. There's an interest in it. This agenda, by the way, of sustainable development is not a simple agenda. It's complicated. How do you remake an energy system? How do you achieve universal connectivity? How does one confront unprecedentedly rapid mega urbanization? These are not simple topics also, so they require a special expertise. I would hope, and again, I don't know the situation, but schools of public administration are essential long-term investments. This is for sure. How to manage master's programs in how to achieve the SDGs ought to be implemented. Project design and investment programming are old topics, but they're as essential today as they've ever been. I was speaking with another large country a couple of days ago, or yesterday actually. They're asking me to help them design training programs for senior cadres of officials, because it's another country, same situation. They're dealing with the mining sector, which is a horrible sector, by the way, internationally. They cheat and steal and bribe and do everything possible to grab your resources and take them away without taxation. So you need expertise to be able to handle this and to avoid getting stuck in this snare of this horrible ISDS process. Because after all, this Tetsis problem in Pakistan started because a local government created a local agency that negotiated way over their heads against the miming law. And then when the Pakistan Supreme Court eventually said, no, that agency had no authority and it was suspect because there were clearly some bribes and other things going on, and it threw out the contract, these arbitrators say, we don't care. We don't listen to the Pakistan Supreme Court. We just decide what we want. And by the way, this is outrageous. And if I were in Pakistan's situation, at that moment, I would have said, well, we're out of here. Our Supreme Court ruled we are a sovereign country. By the way, a large sovereign country. We reject the supranationality of any three-person arbitration panel over our Supreme Court. And I would have called it a day. That's still my advice, by the way. But all of the practical matters of effective public administration mean government needs to know where it belongs and where it doesn't belong. And then where it belongs, it needs to do a good job. And that is true no matter what the political system is, frankly. And in that sense, I think orienting around a certain set of goals and transformations could raise the professionalism if the question is posed to the government. Here are certain key objectives for 2030. This is government role in these areas. Stay in your lane and out of other areas, but how are we going to achieve these objectives? It could help in a practical way to get better organized.
Great, thank you, thank you. Let me call in Harun Sharif, our former Minister for Investments. Harun, go ahead.
Great.
Well, thank you very much, Nadeem, and thank you very much, Professor Sachs. A brief question. I have been working on these issues of investment, and I agree with you that the pie needs to be expanded. My take here is, first of all, that if we really need to mainstream investment for SDGs, first of all, the political leadership should know what SDG is. And let me give you a practical example, and I can say with some confidence, having sat with the cabinet for a year, that, you know, more than 50% of Pakistan's ministers don't even know what SDG actually stand for. So there's a very serious communication gap where the UN system does not have access to the political leadership. The access is with multilateral banks. And multilateral banks only are interested in lending money. They don't talk development, to be very honest. Okay. So one of the question is the political economy question, that how to make it a political priority. Because if it is not, if the client is not demanding it or understanding it, there's no point getting into a dialogue, because the lenders would keep on throwing money wherever they would like. And linked to that is, I would like to explore a little bit more your notion that state investment needs to be, you know, expanded. Why shouldn't private sector take some ownership of SDGs as well? They are a stakeholder, you know, in this whole process, because if we keep on looking, there are two sources of financing in Pakistan. One is the taxpayers' money, the other is borrowing from multilaterals. But I think there is, you know, a case to bring private sector investment in. And I'll quote two very recent developments. Pakistan recently floated $500 million worth of green bonds for climate change resistance. And that was oversubscribed at 7.5%.
Okay.
And today I saw an advertisement of the first social impact investment bond raised from local capital market. Now, my question is that if we keep on looking at the pie of the government, I don't think till 2030 they will even understand to prioritize it unless and until you get a muscle to engage seriously. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Great questions. The reason I'm interested in expanded MDB financing is that I'd like Pakistan to pay 1.5% rather than 7.5%. And I think that because if Germany were borrowing that same tenor, it would pay 0. The United States would pay 1.5%. Japan might be 50 basis points, but the Pakistan government will pay 7.5%. And that I think is in practice a punitive rate, almost a self-fulfilling rate that can lead to trouble down the road. So I would like to expand the MDB side with the proviso that what the MDB is doing is turning the borrowing capacity of the rich countries who are on the board into the lending capacity at low interest rates to the member governments. What you say about the MDBs is so correct, by the way. You know, you're a great practical expert in this, but the MDBs are not primarily development institutions, unfortunately. They are banks. They want to lend, like you say, but they should be development institutions. And part of, it's odd for me. I have complained a lot about the World Bank and others for 25 years, but then I try to raise more money for them at the same time. But it's a kind of package deal that I want more money and for them to do right. And I think that there needs to be the same goal orientation that is directed towards the SDGs inside these institutions as I'm calling for of governments. I hope that most of the senior management of the World Bank would know what the SDGs are, but sometimes you're not so sure. So it's the same deal. But I really take the point. Now, why the public sector? I think the key is the following. First, there is a difference of finance and delivery. So I'm talking about, say, in education, universal access. Private investors in education, privately financed, profit-oriented, will never provide universal access to quality education. This is obvious. Similarly with healthcare, similarly with much of infrastructure. But if the government, through public finance, actually contracts with creative private providers, it could be in the power sector or it could be in other sectors, but uses public finance to ensure universality, but uses the private sector to improve the delivery of services. That kind of mix, I think, is perfectly appropriate. So my emphasis on public financing is universal coverage. And if you can assure that either that's not so important in a particular kind of area, or that it can be achieved through private finance, I'm all for it. Or perhaps it can be achieved through public finance and private sector delivery, which is often with independent power production and so forth, can be another model for effective delivery. What I don't like is privatizing public services and human rights, like access to healthcare and education.
Professor Sachs, before you go, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
What would you like to see in Bretton Woods 2?
What I would,
tinkering at margins, or would it be a substantial change? Right now, what we have is a flow of finance as well as a control of power on the advanced country side, and the international rules are totally written at such a level that we can't even understand them. We have no capacity to understand the international rules. How would you change that? First
of all, I would like, I'm going to call it Bali 1, because I hope that we could actually do that. That the idea would be enshrined in Article 1, that the purpose of the international financial system is to achieve global sustainable development in all parts of the world, so that the financial system is designed for a purpose. The purpose is achieving economic rights and human dignity and environmental sustainability for all, so that the test of the international financial system is that we're actually channeling global resources towards a desired end. Then I think that there are several components that should be part of this discussion. One is liquidity. this comes back to Keynes's debates with Harry Dexter White. But one of the reasons why Pakistan borrows at 7.5% instead of 1% is that it lacks liquidity because it doesn't have a dollar printing press. And because the SDRs is not an adequate replacement. Nor does Pakistan have, I believe, any kind of credit swap line with the Fed. Those countries that do are in much better situation than Pakistan because, say, Korea has a swap line with the Fed. They almost went into financial panic in 2009, but the swap line saved them completely. It stopped the panic immediately. So one issue is liquidity, which does not exist as long as the liquidity is the purview of the US government rather than of an international system. And it is the US government purview right now because the dollar is not only the payment mechanism, but the US uses it in highly political ways, unfortunately. So I would like liquidity to be number one. Second, I would like long-term public financing of global and national public goods. So a greatly scaled up multilateral development system for long-term official financing. Third, we need, as we've been discussing for almost 40 years now, it's where I came into the story, a debt resolution system that makes sense, that does not lead to scarring over 10 or 20 years where you never get out of crisis. This doesn't work. Fourth, I would eliminate the ISDS system because it is inimical to development. And if there is to be investor rights, these should be incorporated per global agreement into national legal systems, in my view. So I would say that investor rights issues could be part of this, but not extra legal rights that don't exist within the national systems. These are some of the topics I would put on the table, but I would call for this meeting in the context of achieving the Paris Climate Agreement and the SDGs. In other words, it's finance for global goals. And we are not, we don't have a system that achieves that now.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. If you have to go, we'll let you go. There are people waiting for questions. We'll debate amongst ourselves.
I'm going to jump now, but I hope we could continue the discussion.
Professor Sachs, it's a pleasure. We applaud you for taking the time out. Pakistan often is left out by great thinkers like you. We appreciate your coming to us. Thank you.
We'll get together soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Anji, Alia, you want to say something? Alia Khan? Alia's gone?
Madam, no, I'm here. I was waiting to be unmuted. Gigi, my concern was, or I wanted to know whether the SDG Solutions Network has a member university from Pakistan, and also if there is any work on how the high population growth rate of Pakistan and the low female labor force participation rate could be pulling down the achievement towards SDGs. So I just wanted to inquire.
Somebody within us maybe can take them up. Shidat Ahmed, anybody who wants to come and jump into the discussion now, please do. Shidat Ahmed.
Am I audible?
Yeah, you are. Bilkul.
Sir, thank you very much. So, going towards the SDG financing, which Professor Sachs has mentioned, but the main concern is data. जो हम लोग जब बलूचिस्तान SDGs का framework बना रहे थे, तो mix भी even different indicators का data ही missing था. So why not we first focus on the data which is required for the research and which is required to have some output rather than going towards financing.
Okay, great. Thank you. Shaheen and Nisar.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum. I think while Professor Jeffrey Sachs had been talking about SDGs and all that, I think it was a good conversation. But what I found missing was the financing, how to reduce the financing gap. And I think the main reason is the capacity within the government. Having interacted with the previous colleagues at PIDE and other people in Pakistan, I realized that this is the capacity gap in the government, and the attitude gap is great. There are certain biases which is preventing Pakistan from achieving the SDGs. When he's talking about the climate change and the SDG agenda, and talking about the global goal, that really means that there are certain funding taking place, which Pakistan can very much use. Like there are different types of trust funds also. And I would like to see Pakistan using those trust funds and promoting the capacity within the different agencies. And I think that would be the starting point. And we can make use of it. And in my evaluation of those trust funds, I would like to say that, that money, the donor money, can be used for capacity building. And I think Pakistan should seriously look into it. Still, people do not have the right answers regarding public-private partnership. They think that, energy deals were not right and all that, but that deal had a certain component. It's an art to go ahead with PPPs, but I think the private sector should be mobilized, and the world is mobilizing private sector. We have to have a mode and attitude where we are pulling up forces with, like partnership approach, not you versus government versus the private sector. So I'll stop here.
China, what do you mean by trust funds?
Trust funds are the donor funds, for example, the dedicated funds for climate action, for example. And there are a lot of different trust funds, and the World Bank has been a trustee of trust funds also. So, and and each trust fund has a certain governance mechanism also. So there are certain ways that one could succeed in it. And I have seen that, people, the government, if there is somebody who knows how the trust fund works, they try to put it as a vehicle, like they build up a case to use that funding. And I think Pakistan should look into, recently I've come across the WASH program, where the USAID has these funds, and I could not see Pakistan, even though Pakistan has a lot of issues in the transboundary water issues and other issues. But you need to know how these trust funds work, what are their objectives, and there's an internal governance system in them. And I think Pakistan should start looking into those aspects and making use of those trust funds so that you build capacities. And they are free. They are free, but you have to fulfill different conditions according to the trust funds.
Great. Ahmed Gurani Saab, can you educate us a little bit about this and other things?
No, on the trust funds, it's Shushaina. I think you know better than me. I mean, the trust funds come with a lot of ties. I mean, yes, they're free, but I think they create more chaos than they solve. I think at some point in the Pakistan office, initially back in the 90s and early 2000s, these trust funds are actually banned when John Wall was here and Vansang Gordon was running the infra portfolio, because they, these $200,000, $1 million, $2 million, everybody runs amok with their own little silos and creates more confusion for the government. So I think what you're saying is right. I think trust funds should be accessed, but there should be access to just get the right consultants once a larger fiscal or financial program is in place. And I think that a problem, Nadeem Saab, and I wanted to just pause it, I think Harun's still here. I think what we heard was a lot about how much money one has. One did not hear a lot about what is it that we do with the money that we do spend. So the efficiency and efficacy question was, again, are we targeting it right? And the reason I say this is because in hearing Professor Sachs, I mean, I was very, very happy. I mean, he hasn't changed a bit, but I see him, he has calmed down in the last 5 years, which is probably because, as he said, he needs money and then he has to go after the same money. But I think that bottom line is that, you know, one thing we need to ask ourselves. The day before yesterday on TV, a bunch of youth got after me saying that, you know, is the budget spending increased on youth? I said, what does it mean budget spending on youth? Does the government have to give you jobs? Is that what you consider? And that's pretty much their understanding. So I think one of the things in these debates is that we want to make sure that everybody who comes here understands how a public expenditure review works, how things are targeted. So as part of Harun's question, which is how SDGs work, does everybody know? So I think another question, which even like, you know, oh yes, an offline debate with PVP and bipartisan debate, which basically talks about how much of what we are spending currently is going towards achieving the SDGs. So I think that accounting is not done judiciously. I think the second point, which I also wanted to raise, is that, you know, this debate on tax and do we collect enough tax, I think is thwarting us from getting into the real problem, which is the waste that we are spending. So let me ask a last question. And I asked this day before yesterday, and I think I got shot. I said, you know, what is it? You know, everybody here knows what a throw forward is, what an existing portfolio is. So if we were to take all development spending, forget any of what we are spending in recurrent. So I'm asking that for a very small amount of our budget, which is like what, 900 billion, or maybe if you include the ADPs, it comes to what, another 5 trillion. So the issue, 5 trillion. So the issue that is that if we were to say from today until the next 10 years, we are not going to bring a single project, new project online, but we are going to take all the money that we have, that delta, which is over and above finishing the current projects, and we're going to convert that into a universal basic income and give it to people or groups of people in Pakistan to spend and do with as they want. I think there would be still better efficiency in that than letting the government put in and load us with new debts and everything else. So I stop here and thank you.
Good question. Agreed, agreed. Mohammad Mudassar sir. Mohammad Mudassar.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम मेरी आवाज आ रही है
जी आ रही है इंट्रोड्यूस योरसेल्फ
जी बिल्कुल लाइक जिस तरह दुरानी साहब ने कहा कि सबसे बड़ा मसला गवर्नेंस का है तो मेरा थीसिस पे भी यही फोकस था कि हम कोई ऐसा कंपोजिट इंडिकेटर बना सकते हैं जिस तरह लाइक ये जो सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट रिपोर्ट है इस पे अगर हम पब्लिक ऑफिशियल्स को लाइक पाइड इस पे बहुत बड़ा किरदार अदा कर सकता है कि इसको हम एक इंडिकेटर बनाएं कि इस पे कितना जो है फोकस रहा है, इस पे कितनी हमारी जो है स्पेंडिंग रही है। मतलब गवर्नेंस तब हमारी ठीक होगी जब हमारे गवर्नर्स जो है वो अकाउंटेबल होंगे हमको। तो लाइक नेक्स्ट टाइम व्हेन आई गो टू वोट मैं उस कंपोजिट इंडिकेटर को देखूंगा कि उस पे लाइक सबसे अच्छी परफॉर्मेंस किसकी रही है। तो मेरा ये है कि इस पे हम अपनी डिबेट ज़रा बढ़ाएं। पाइड बहुत अच्छा रोल इस पे प्ले कर सकता है तो आई वांट टू लाइक extend this discussion actually.
Thank you. Shujaat Ahmed sir, you want to come in again?
So just taking lead from Durrani Saab's point and Durrani Saab's question regarding youth, are we producing good youth from our universities or are we just producing degree holders? Like there are many universities, many academic institutes where number of degrees are more than number of even faculty, and those degrees are like even, for example, I'll take this biotechnology or bioinformatics. Back in 2004-5, I was just listening to this friend that this degree has greater scope in the future, but still we are just identifying where that future is. So what are we producing in our universities?
Thank you. Sohail Awan sir.
Thank you very much. This is Sohail Awan, CEO of Human Development Foundation. Taking from the point of Shujat and from Professor Sachs, yes, there's a financing gap. Definitely, we need to close on. But at the same time, I feel that there is a fundamental problem of how we do things. The framework, the strategies of the programs, whether it's a health, whether it's education, and whether it's, talking about the higher education institutions. That is the leakage, the efficiency. Again, yes, it goes back to the buck stops at the governors, but the way we are doing things, and in this country, in this very country, there are certain models where the results were produced, how infant mortality rate came down. So we really need to look into totality. Yes, while looking at the financing gaps, but this is something where even the private sector has a role, not only the government, as well as, and not in terms of financing only, but at least the way we do stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nazam Makbul. Nazam.
Yes, sir, I'm unmuted now. Sir, I would like to very briefly highlight 3 points when I was listening the whole debate. When we talk about SDGs, there are 17 SDGs, 169 targets, and 230 indicators. So I wouldn't go in detail. I was just thinking that when we talk about Pakistan, do we need to have narrowed down some specific things out of this whole framework, or do we need to follow this whole huge framework? Number one. Number two is that, okay, if you want to achieve this everything, then we need money. But when we talk about money, we have to see our budget. So I was reading an article, it was written there that 2/3 of our total net federal revenue in the next year would go for debt servicing. So my point is that, do we have space for money if we want to go for this whole thing? Third point is that, okay, if we have money, so we can find the solution. Then I was looking towards the education budget of Pakistan versus Bangladesh versus Sri Lanka. For 2017, based on World Bank data, our money allocation for education was higher than Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. But why not our education outcomes were better than them? Thank you, sir.
Good points, good points. Meher Akhtar.
Ji, Assalamualaikum. Ji, Assalamualaikum. My question was again regarding health, because we are in the intra-pandemic situation. So we should concentrate on 2 things, is creating awareness about health issues. And I think PIDE should actively work in the improvement of SDG, achievement of SDG 3s, and improving public awareness about public interest in health, because that's a major gap we have identified in Pakistan regarding population, regarding maternal health, regarding nutrition. So that should be a focus for PIDE also, for health, on health issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ji. Thank you. Furqan Asad Sohail.
Ji, Assalamu alaikum. So it's Furqan here. I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Sheffield. And I'm currently working on a project that is implementation of sustainable development goals in a private sector space in Pakistan. So my question basically is that, what do you think is the role of Pakistan's private sector in furthering the SDGs? And how can we evaluate or account for the progress of private sector's implementation of sustainable development goals? This question is important because when we look at the national level rankings, for example, Jeffery ne baat ki thi ke we are ranked at 129th, right? When we look at the national ranking, the national level data is incomplete without looking at the private sector SDG implementation, because and the private sector is important because it drives the economic activity. So in short, what's the role of private sector in Pakistan in terms of SDGs implementation, and how can we account for their progress in implementation?
जी, अली कमाल साहब आप बताइए.
जी जी सर, वो बहुत टेम्पटिंग था, एसडीजीज पे हो रहा था एंड I thought कि मैं ना बोलूं. Anyways, sir, there are several things. First of all, we need to think in a proper way. SDGs are basically more of a qualitative nature than a quantitative nature. Quality पे जब फोकस किया जाए तो वहाँ पे फाइनेंसिंग से ज्यादा गवर्नेंस की जरूरत है, नंबर 1. Number 2, we have been increasing funding or financing for health and education पिछले 5-10 साल से, जब से 2013 से devolution आया है. एजुकेशन के इंडिकेटर्स PSLM उठा के देख लें, नहीं चेंज हुए हैं. हेल्थ के इंडिकेटर्स आर इम्प्रूविंग. क्या वजह है? सर्विस डिलीवरी. As far as private sector is concerned, we are holding a conference on 13th as far as the planning commission is concerned, but private sector के 4 पीछे major projects हो चुके हैं, which include PSX, Pakistan Business Council, FPCCI, and there are several other. फरूक मोरियानी वगैरह ने भी काम किया है. अभी भी बहुत सारे प्राइवेट सेक्टर कहते हैं हमें नहीं पता हमें क्या करना है. सर, कंप्लायंस कर लें, रिसाइकलिंग कर लें, रीयूज कर लें, वेस्ट कम कर लें. बहुत सारे ऐसे चीजें हो सकती हैं जहाँ पे प्राइवेट सेक्टर कैन पार्टिसिपेट. As far as, sir, again, last point, financing is concerned, there are 169 outcomes. 169 outcomes के लिए there are several MOIs which are means of implementations. Means of implementation के 60 जो हैं वो impact करेंगे outcomes को, and उनको हमने handle करना है, and then governance is the main thing. So जहाँ तक financing है, PIDE की study हो चुकी है financing पे, PARI की study हो चुकी है, SDPI ने कुछ टकरें मारी हैं, इस तरह के बहुत सारी और ऑर्गेनाइजेशन टकरें मारी हैं. फाइनेंसिंग हर एक की सिंपल नहीं आएगी. MDGs की फाइनेंसिंग की पूरी एक्सरसाइज हुई थी जो फाइनेंस ने और बहुत सारे और ऑर्गेनाइजेशन में ने डब्बों में बंद कर दी थी. सो करें फाइनेंसिंग पे काम या नहीं है, लेकिन सर्विस डिलीवरी एट द लोकल लेवल इज अ मेजर थिंग जिससे ये SDGs हमारे अचीव हो सकेंगे. थैंक यू.
Thank you. Well, Lisa, sorry.
जी, who wants to speak?
I just wanted to add something to Ali's point on PIDE and PC quickly. So Ali, you may recall, because a lot of people here have asked what is being done. So both on the PIDE platform and आपके platform से आपको याद होगा कमर शौजर के साथ हमने 18, 19, 24th December को, there's a whole series of discussion we held on how outcomes can be measured against the money going in, even down to the ward level. If you remember, Pakistan Bureau of Statistics was also involved in that. And then the UN folks that were there said that they were doing something similar. But just to let all the people who are listening and ask this question, there is a PIDE paper that was done in 2019, which basically also talks about the outcomes coming at a district level. And so basically the same data can be utilized with the ward classification, which is available from PBS if they share that data at basically that particular column. So that can be done. Thank you, Nadeem Saab. Sorry for the interruption.
No problem. I just wanted to ask Ali Kamal a question. I think he's disappeared. Ali Kamal says the Planning Commission is holding a conference. Has anybody been invited to this conference, or is this a very closed conference? Because isn't that the problem with the government, that they don't want to involve the Pakistani intellectual in the conversation? Am I right? Has anybody been invited to this conference? No. Ali Kamal, can you please tell us, is this conference you talking to yourself or the government talking to itself?
No, government is not talking to itself. When the private sector is invited, then the whole private sector cannot be invited, but we invite most of the large forums. As far as the academia is concerned, we are holding the university and the academia, and that's thanks for asking. There are several people who said the PIDE should do this. There are 188 universities all over Pakistan. They should do all research on these things, whether it's a scientific, whether it's a physics, whether it's social science, or the other disciplines. So ये सारे के सारे मिलके ये काम होगा. Just PIDE cannot do.
No, mashallah, मैं PIDE की बात ही नहीं कर रहा था.
Sir, दूसरी चीज है कि when we had the conference, so PIDE people are there. University people are there. एक ही conference हुई, but the private sector engagement we are going to do on the 13th, अभी ये आज ही डिसाइड हुआ है।
यानी को 13th को हुकूमत सेठों के साथ बात करेगी, जो हुकूमत वैसे ही सेठों के साथ रोज बात करती है। भाई रोज तो प्राइवेट सेक्टर फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर के पास बैठा होता है, प्लानिंग मिनिस्टर के पास बैठा होता है, तो एक और आपने उनके साथ बात कर ली तो किसी को क्या फर्क पड़ा? क्यों कोई जानता है कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर हुकूमत के पास कब नहीं बैठा होता? 24 घंटे तो वो बैठे होते हैं। हारून शरीफ साहब बताइए, वुड यू क्लैरिफाई दिस सब्जेक्ट प्लीज? हारून शरीफ,
मेरा माइक खोले ना तो मैं आपको बताता हूँ।
बताइए प्राइवेट सेक्टर के साथ कितनी कंसल्टेशन होनी चाहिए सेठों के साथ, यानी कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर छोड़ दें सेठों के साथ?
देखिए, इसमें लाइटर टोन पे बात यह है कि मैं पिछले 8 माह में तकरीबन 6 वजीरों के पास गया, और जो डिफरेंट एसडीजीज से जिनका ताल्लुक बनता था, और टू बी वेरी ऑनेस्ट किसी ने भी उसके ऊपर इंटरेस्ट या ओनरशिप नहीं दी, इंक्लूडिंग द प्लानिंग मिनिस्टर। ओके, अच्छा, फिर मैंने प्लानिंग मिनिस्टर जो मेरे बहुत अच्छे दोस्त हैं, मैंने उनसे कहा कि देखो, एक यूएन के अंदर न्यूयॉर्क में रोड शो हो रहा है, तो वहां पे जरा अपना केस पेश करें। उस पे भी उन्होंने बाद में एग्री किया, फिर गायब हो गए। एंड टू बी वेरी टू इंटरेस्टिंगली, आप सोचे कौन सा वजीर इस पे काम कर रहा है? दैट इज शाह महमूद कुरैशी। सो जिनका कोई इम्प्लीमेंटेशन से ताल्लुक नहीं है, जिनका कुछ भी नहीं है, सो ही बेसिकली कि यूएन से उनका ताल्लुक है। तो एसडीजी का पाकिस्तान का फेस इस वक्त शाह महमूद कुरैशी है। लेट मी एक्सप्लेन टू यू इंटरनेशनल। अच्छा, तो ओनरशिप का सवाल मैं इसलिए रेज कर रहा था कि वहां पे तो है ही नहीं। जहां तक कंसल्टेशन की बात है, देखें, प्राइवेट सेक्टर, टू बी वेरी ऑनेस्ट, जिसको हम रिप्रेजेंटेटिव कहते हैं, वो लोग तो दे आर सिटिंग इन द गवर्नमेंट, दे डोंट हैव टू एक्चुअली बी कंसल्टेड। उनके नुमाइंदे कैबिनेट में बैठे हैं, उनके बंदे हर मिनिस्ट्री में बैठे हैं, उनकी तो कंसल्टेशन की जरूरत ही नहीं है, जो बिग बॉयज है। लेकिन उनके लिए अगर कोई मॉडल डेवलप करना है, देन अ सीरियस डिबेट नीड्स टू बी डन कि इनको आपने इंडिपेंडेंटली कैसे, या तो पैसा टेबल पर रखें। आई विल क्लोज, प्राइम मिनिस्टर के पास उनकी फरमाइश पर मैं कोई ये 50 जो बिग बॉयज हैं, इनको हर तीसरे महीने लेके जाता था। मैंने उनसे कहा कि टेक्नोलॉजी के लिए फंड बनाना है, आप सारे $1 लाख देंगे। एवरीबडी डिक्लाइंड। सो $1 लाख शायद वो एक महीने में अपनी एंटरटेनमेंट पे खर्चते हैं। Everyone declined. I asked Azad Daud, can you pull it? He declined. So मैं आपको बता रहा हूँ, वो प्राइवेट सेक्टर को जरूरत ही नहीं है, वो तो अंदर बैठा हुआ है। So the question here is कि अगर वाकई हमने किसी को engage करना है, so then we need to pick up people who understand markets, not really people जो कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर चला रहे हैं। So that's my take. बट आपको एसडीजी का मैं बताता हूँ, मिनिस्ट्रियल ओनरशिप किसके पास है? वो मुनीर अकरम और शाह महमूद के पास।
देखिए, मसला तो यही है ना कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर तो हर जगह है। अगर कॉमर्स पॉलिसी होती है तो प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैठा होता है, वो पीबीसी। अगर एसआरओ पॉलिसी होती है वही बैठे होते हैं, हर जगह तो वो बैठे होते हैं। तो
बैठे नहीं, वो वहां है, इट्स देयर।
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल। तो ठीक है, 13 को उनके साथ कंसल्टेशन हो जाएगी। जी मेहर अख्तर,
जी जी, मेरा मैंने पाइड से इसलिए कहा था बिकॉज यू आर होल्डिंग दिस सेमिनार एंड इट्स वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट दैट इंस्टीट्यूट्स लाइक पाइड टेक अ लीड इन। अब जैसे हेल्थ में पब्लिक इंटरेस्ट का पाकिस्तान में कोई अंडरस्टैंडिंग नहीं है। देखिए, डॉक्टर जेफरी सैक्स ने इस पे बहुत एम्फसिस दिया, और वो खुद भी कितनी पब्लिक इंटरेस्ट की बात करते। जैसे आप तो खैर डॉक्टर नदीम, आई एग्री विथ यू कि ये इसी तरह क्लोज डोर्स सेमिनार्स होते हैं और इनकी अपनी चंद लोगों से होती है। लार्जर पब्लिक डिबेट, लार्जर इंटरेस्ट ऑफ public, it is not debated in Pakistan, and it is very essential। हम इंट्रा पैंडेमिक सिचुएशन में हैं और ये हमारी इकोनॉमीज को तबाह कर रही है, और इट इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट। देखिए, मलेशिया की इकोनॉमी अब किस तरह से डाउन जा रही है। सिंगापुर इसलिए अपने आप को खोल रहा है कि वो सस्टेन नहीं कर पा रहे हैं। तो ये हम लोग किस यूटोपिया में बैठे हुए, किस हम ग्रे एरियाज में हमारा दिमाग घुमा हुआ है। वी हैव टू अंडरस्टैंड कि पब्लिक डिबेट, पब्लिक पॉलिसी, ओपन डोर पॉलिसी इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर पाकिस्तान नाउ, और स्पेशली फॉर हेल्थ।
पब्लिक डिबेट हो जाती है जब पीबीसी से हुकूमत बात करे। अच्छा जी, चाइना निसार, चाइना यू देयर? चाइना है, चली गई है मेरे ख्याल।
She is left, madam. Sir, she is left.
सोहेल अबान साहब बोलिए। सोहेल अबान साहब, सोहेल अबान साहब भी चले गए?
जी 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 जी, मैं मौजूद हूँ। मैं आपको याद होगा, मैंने ये जो पब्लिक डिबेट वाला मामला है सरकार पे छोड़ा, तो जाहिर है सरकार तो ऐसे ही करेगी। यू रिमेम्बर नदीम साहब, वी डिस्कस्ड के जो पाकिस्तान की ये ह्यूमन डेवलपमेंट रिपोर्ट आई है जो डॉक्टर हफीज पाशा ने की है, उसके ऊपर हमें एक डिबेट करनी चाहिए। असल में मेरा ख्याल ये है कि सरकार पे तो हम रहेंगे तो शायद ये कुछ भी नहीं बन पाएगा। मतलब ऑनेस्टली वी एज अ सिविल सोसाइटी और जो लोग हैं जो काम कर रहे हैं इन चीजों पे, वी रियली नीड टू चिप इन और वी नीड टू पुश दिस डिबेट, ताकि सरकार को भी इस बात का अंदाजा हो कि नहीं, देयर इज एन अल्टरनेट अवेलेबल फॉर दिस।
Thank you very much, ji. Thank you everybody. I think you had a great session. Wonderful, good ideas. But सरकार को क्या करे? अली कमाल आ गया because ये PIDE का बंदा है. I don't think there's a single bureaucrat or politician in today's session. We hold, Sohail Sahab, many webinars every week, not just now and again. We hold at least 2 or 3 webinars a week, and we do it deliberately because we want a public debate. This is the only way to do it, to come out and talk about things. But the thing that is very evident, abundantly clear, that Jeffery Sachs can't know, उसको नहीं पता चल सकता, सिर्फ हमें पता कि हमारे यहाँ जो अफसरशाही है ये बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है। और ये अफसरशाही में बात वो सिर्फ अपने जैसे लोगों से बात करते हैं। ये बेसिकली सेंट क्लब में डिस्कशन होती है। सेंट क्लब के लोग आ जाते हैं, पी ब्लॉक क्यू ब्लॉक बात कर लेते हैं। मैं भी वहाँ था, मैंने कई दफा देखा है, मैंने कई दफा उनको छेड़ा कि यार ये हो क्या रहा है, हमारे ऑर्डनरी बंदे कहाँ हैं? पर हम ऑर्डनरी बंदों से बात नहीं करते। पर हम लोग आपस में अगर डिबेट उछालें तो शायद बात करेंगे। So I urge you all to please come to PIDE webinars, hold your own webinars, we'll come there. Let's begin a debate outside the government. Let's talk about things. The web has offered us a great opportunity. Let's expand it. Let's use it. Let's expand the topics. Amir Durrani, for example, has done a great job holding these railway webinars for us. Wonderful. I think that it's a great, very credible task. Other people I invite, please come and help us. Please help us do things so that we expand the debate outside. The debate will never get into the government. The government will never accept the civil society, except as a small funding mechanism. But don't worry about it. Let's have a debate. Let's put the ideas out. Let's talk about it. Let's develop new things. Let's begin a citation community. Let's begin a policy community. Change takes a long time. It doesn't happen immediately. It will not happen by us saying today what needs to be done. It won't happen. It will happen if all of us get together and take it over the long term. It may take 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. Certainly it won't happen in our lifetime. It will happen probably in the children's lifetime. I'm not even sure of that. But if you don't talk about it, it will never happen. Thank you very much, folks. It's been a wonderful occasion. Let's talk again. We are having another webinar tomorrow. Please join us on Exports. Thank you. Bye-bye. Khuda Hafiz.